From November 1942 through to the end of the war, every Mosquito that 105 Squadron put into the air carried a mechanical secret inside each of its two Merlin engines. Not a rumour passed between ground crews, not a workshop habit that drifted through the fleet by accident. A spring. A calibrated coil spring inside a pressure-sensing capsule, adjusted to hold a higher boost level than Rolls-Royce certified, higher than the Air Ministry authorized, and higher than any specification sheet in any department permitted. The modification turned plus 18 pounds per square inch of manifold pressure into plus 20, 2 extra pounds. On paper, a trivial increment. In an unarmed bomber flying daylight precision raids over occupied Western Europe, an aircraft with no guns, no armour, nothing between its crew and an intercepting fighter except speed, it reportedly amounted to the difference between outrunning a Focke-Wulf and being caught by one. The question worth asking isn't whether it worked. The question is how a small coiled component inside a brass-and-bellows controller became more operationally decisive than the official limits that governed every Merlin engine in service. On 15th of November 1941, a single de Havilland Mosquito B Mark IV, serial number W4064, arrived at RAF Swanton Morley in Norfolk. Geoffrey de Havilland's own son delivered it personally. It was the first operational Mosquito bomber taken on charge by the Royal Air Force, and it went to 105 Squadron. A second aircraft, W4066, followed 2 days later, and was, due to technical problems with the first, actually the one that entered practical service. Both were powered by a pair of Rolls-Royce Merlin 21 engines, producing approximately 1,230 to 1,460 horsepower each, turning wooden propellers on a wooden airframe assembled largely from spruce and birch plywood bonded with synthetic resin. The smell in the cockpit after a long flight at altitude was wood and oil and cold. The fuselage creaked under load in a way aluminium-skinned aircraft didn't. It looked fragile. It wasn't. The Mosquito had no guns, no armour. A crew of two, pilot and navigator, seated side by side in a narrow compartment barely wide enough for both men's shoulders. A bomb bay capable of carrying 4 500-pound bombs internally, and a design philosophy that de Havilland had committed to in writing years before the aircraft flew. If you are faster than the interceptors, defensive armament adds weight that reduces your speed, making your situation worse rather than better. Speed wasn't a convenience, it was the survival mechanism. The silence of the airframe wasn't a mysterious omission or a cost-cutting measure that nobody caught. It was a deliberate doctrine, argued explicitly at Air Ministry meetings, resisted initially and ultimately accepted. Number 2 Group, Bomber Command, put that doctrine to work. From around June 1942, 105 Squadron flew low-level daylight precision raids from RAF Horsham St Faith in Norfolk, Cologne, Oslo, Eindhoven, targets across occupied Europe. Small formations of aircraft, sometimes as few as 3, flying at rooftop height across the North Sea, pulling up at the last moment to release their bombs, and then diving away again before the defences could properly track them. The attacks were surgical in concept, brutal in execution. Crews who flew the early raids described the approach phase as 70 or 80 miles of absolute concentration at low altitude over water, then the coast of occupied Europe coming up fast. The bombs had to go down at the right moment. The aircraft had to turn hard before the flak found its aim, and the departure had to happen faster than anything the interceptors could arrange. The squadron moved in late September 1942 to RAF Marham, Norfolk, where 139 Squadron joined them. The raids continued. The doctrine held as long as the speed margin held. The margin was closing. In August 1941, 2 JG-26, the second Gruppe of Jagdgeschwader 26, based at Abbeville in northern France and known to Allied aircrew as the Abbeville Boys, began flying combat missions with the Focke-Wulf FW-190A1. By September, 2 JG-26 was completely equipped with the type. The RAF Air Staff issued a directive in November 1941 halting operations over Northern Europe in response. That directive reflects the severity of the shock the FW-190's arrival produced. It wasn't simply that the Germans had a new fighter, it was that this one reversed the advantage the Spitfire Mark V had enjoyed over the Bf-109F at low to medium altitude. The FW-190 had better acceleration out of a dive, a higher roll rate, and a higher top speed in the band up to roughly 20,000 feet, which was precisely the band in which No. 2 Group's Mosquito operations took place. A Spitfire 5 pilot, who met an FW-190A and tried to disengage, found he couldn't simply pull away. That was a new experience. It was a bad sign for anyone who depended on outrunning things for a living. What the FW-190's arrival meant for the Mosquito was a specific and uncomfortable calculation. The survival theory was built on a speed gap, a reliable margin of perhaps 30 to 50 miles per hour between what the Mosquito could do flat out and what the fastest available interceptor could produce. The gap didn't need to be enormous. It just needed to exist consistently. An interceptor scrambled late, still climbing as the Mosquito cleared the target, needed to catch an aircraft already at cruise speed pulling away. That interception geometry was only workable for the fighter if the gap was small enough to close before the Mosquito reached the coast. Against the Bf-109E and the early Bf-109F, the geometry rarely worked in the fighter's favor. Against the FW-190A at low altitude, the arithmetic tightened dangerously. By August 1942, Mosquitoes from 105 Squadron attacked the electricity station at Pont-Avendain and were intercepted head-on by FW-190s that then turned to attack from the stern. The Mosquitoes used their speed to outpace them, but the margin was close enough to be felt rather than comfortable. Late-model FW-190 variants, by some accounts, had as much as a 40-mile-per-hour advantage over Mosquito bombers in certain engagement conditions. Whether any specific interception in late 1942 actually featured that gap in reverse is harder to document with precision. What is clear from the squadron's operational history is that by this period, crews were aware the protection their aircraft had started with was being eroded. Ground crews were polishing airframes, buffing the wooden skin to a higher surface finish, trying to recover a few extra knots from reduced drag. Optimistic estimates put the gain at around 15 knots, a real measure showing how acutely the problem was felt, but a measure that addressed aerodynamic drag, not engine output. Polishing the skin of an aircraft does not change what happens inside the boost controller. The problem was the power ceiling. Recovering the margin required someone to go inside the engine. The person who reportedly did that was Francis Rodwell Banks, not Roderick, not Roderick, not a sergeant or a fitter operating in secret at the back of a dispersal hangar. Recent years have produced a cluster of video essays that attach those names and that rank to this story. One version gives Roderick Banks a death date of 1992, an age of 76, and a location of Derby. Details that are directly incompatible with the confirmed biographical record. Francis Rodwell Banks was born on the 22nd of March 1898 and died in 1985 at age 87. His middle name was Rodwell. His nickname, used consistently throughout his career in British aeronautical circles, was Rod. The compression to Roderick is a modern error, almost certainly arising from a careless reading of Rod Banks or Rodwell Banks in a secondary text. No historical document in the archival or biographical record uses that name. The Royal Aeronautical Society held an audio interview with him, accessible through their archive and their website, where it's titled Audio, an interview with Air Commodore Rod Banks, Honfres. He was Honorary Fellow of the Royal Aeronautical Society, the highest distinction the Society can confer, and he served as its president in 1969 and 1970. His 1978 memoir, published by Airlife Publications and running to 247 pages, bore the cover credit Air Commodore Francis Rodwell, Rod, Banks. The name on the spine was Banks. The name that identified him throughout his engineering career was Rod. Roderick appears nowhere in the primary record. In late 1942, Banks held the position of Deputy Director General of Engine Production in the Ministry of Aircraft Production, the department coordinating under Lord Beaverbrook. He didn't yet carry the title Director of Engine Production or the rank of Air Commodore. Those came with a formal appointment in January 1944. But his position in late 1942 was senior enough to place him inside the institutional architecture that set and certified the Merlin's operational limits. He had worked extensively on high-octane fuel development before the war, including the special fuel cocktails used in the Schneider Trophy contests of the late 1920s and early 1930s. A 1950 article in the Aeronautical Journal confirms he maintained close contact with American aviation and fuel technologists throughout the war years, and had developed detailed understanding of supercharger performance through research conducted partly in the United States. He understood the physics governing the Merlin's boost limits more precisely than most of his contemporaries. He also understood, with equal precision, exactly what it meant institutionally to exceed them without authorization. The limit he reportedly chose to exceed wasn't an administrative artifact. It was an engineering boundary with a physical basis. In a normally functioning spark ignition engine, the plug fires and a controlled flame front moves outward through the air-fuel charge. Pressure rises in an ordered curve as the piston approaches top dead center. Boost pressure, the manifold pressure produced by forcing more air into the cylinder than ambient pressure alone would provide, increases the density of that charge. More air, more fuel, more power. But there is a ceiling. Compress the charge past the octane threshold of the fuel and a different process initiates. The unburned end gas in the chamber, the portion the flame front hasn't yet reached, arrives at a temperature and pressure at which it ignites spontaneously before the propagating flame arrives. That spontaneous ignition fires its own combustion front, sometimes at near sonic velocity, and the two fronts collide inside the cylinder. The resulting shock wave through the charge is what engineers call detonation, or knock. Detonation isn't a gentle inefficiency. It's a destructive event that attacks the engine's metal with each pulse. Mild knock pits piston crowns with a sandblasted texture visible to the eye upon inspection. Severe knock erodes and craters the crown material, collapses ringlands, fragments piston rings into the bore, scores cylinder walls from ring drag, and delivers repeated high-speed pressure spikes to the upper halves of connecting rod bearings, the exact bearing surface not designed to absorb that loading. The FAA's safety literature, drawing on engine overhaul experience, describes the forces as sufficient to knock holes in pistons, bend connecting rods, and overcome the lubrication film in rod bearings. Prolonged detonation can bend or break rods entirely and crack cylinder heads. These aren't theoretical failure modes. They are failure modes documented in aircraft engine overhaul records from this period. Rolls-Royce knew this intimately. Packard's documentation of the Merlin, produced when Packard built the engine under license for American production, notes explicitly that the two-stage supercharger could raise charge temperature to approximately 400 degrees Fahrenheit without intercooling, and that intercooling was introduced specifically to prevent detonation of the compressed charge. The plus 18 psi limit wasn't a conservative guess padded with bureaucratic safety margin. It was the engineering boundary above which the fuel grade in operational use could no longer reliably suppress spontaneous ignition. By late 1942, 105 Squadron's Mosquitoes were running on 100-octane aviation fuel, standard for Merlin-powered aircraft from 1940, when the RAF formally converted its frontline aircraft to the higher grade and raised boost ceilings accordingly. Running a Merlin at plus 20 on 100 octane moved the engine beyond its rated ceiling and toward the detonation margin. Not necessarily catastrophic at every moment of flight under favorable conditions of mixture and cooling, but genuinely dangerous at sustained high power settings or any deviation from ideal. The limit was real. The detonation it guarded against was real. Crossing it wasn't a symbolic act of bureaucratic defiance. Inside the Merlin's induction system, a device called the automatic boost controller enforces that limit. And this is where the story arrives at its central object. The controller is a small, precise instrument. In the hand, it weighs perhaps a few pounds, a compact assembly of brass and steel machined to close tolerances. It fits within the engine bay without drama, unremarkable from the outside, a housing connected to the induction system by a port and to the throttle mechanism by linkage. Inside that housing, the architecture of authority over the engine's power ceiling is entirely mechanical. At the core is a pressure-sensing aneroid capsule, not a rough component, not a shop fabrication, but a precision instrument. A rigid cylindrical shell encloses an evacuated metallic bellows, sealed against the reference of vacuum. Manifold pressure from the Merlin's mechanically driven supercharger enters the aneroid chamber and acts on that bellows, compressing or expanding it in direct proportion to the pressure the engine is producing. Against the bellows works a calibrated coil spring, the pressure balance spring in the technical literature, bearing on the stem attached to the metallic bellows. The spring and the bellows pressure oppose each other. When they are in equilibrium, the bellows sits still. When the bellows shifts, it moves a small distributor piston valve. That valve ports boost pressure and depression, vacuum from the induction system, to opposite sides of a relay piston in the same housing. The relay piston, through a mechanical linkage connecting to the carburetor, opens or closes the throttle plates. If manifold pressure rises above the calibrated reference, if the bellows is compressed further than the spring load allows, the distributor valve shifts, the relay piston moves in the closing direction, the throttle plates reduce airflow, boost pressure drops back, the bellows returns to neutral. The system stabilizes. It holds the boost ceiling at exactly the point the spring and capsule combination specifies. One sentence for clarity before moving further. The Merlin's compressor is driven mechanically off the crankshaft, not by exhaust gases. This is a supercharged engine, not a turbocharged one. A turbocharger is governed by exhaust flow and a separate wastegate mechanism. The exhaust spins a turbine that drives the impeller, and a spring-loaded valve bleeds exhaust pressure to limit boost. The Merlin's gear-driven centrifugal blower runs at approximately 6.4 times crankshaft speed in low gear and 8.1 times in high gear, spinning continuously as long as the engine runs. It doesn't need exhaust energy. It produces boost because it's mechanically connected and turning fast. The boost controller's function is therefore to limit the pressure the blower produces, to hold the engine inside the certified ceiling by throttling back at the moment manifold pressure reaches the calibrated reference. Change the spring and the reference shifts. The equilibrium point moves. The ceiling moves with it. The engine runs higher, to a new specific and repeatable level determined entirely by the new spring and capsule combination. This wasn't theoretical innovation. Documented wartime Merlin engineering shows exactly this class of modification applied through official channels in adjacent systems. A formal modification to the Merlin's boost control cutout, the BCCO, already in the system as a safety device, worked by adding a precisely drilled internal orifice that changed the pressure ratio acting on the aneroid, recalibrating the controllable boost ceiling upward. Documented descriptions of the Spitfire's BCCO conversion explain how activating the cutout changed airflow to the aneroid chamber, effectively recalibrating it to a substantially higher rated boost. Across different Merlin variants, changes to spring strength were used as a design variable to shift boost control characteristics between production marks. The Merlin 45M used the same carburetor as the Merlin 45, but with a stronger boost control spring, a direct precedent for the class of change the Banks story describes. The Merlin's boost controller development history, drawn from Rolls-Royce internal records, shows the auto boost control system was designed to handle boost levels up to 30 pounds per square inch. The architecture was built to be recalibrated. What Rod Banks reportedly did was apply that recalibration at squadron level, without authorization, to every aircraft 105 Squadron put into the air. The claim rests on modern narrative accounts rather than a wartime technical order or Air Ministry memo. No primary archival document located in the available research records the specific act. But the mechanism those accounts describe is physically coherent, consistent with documented Merlin engineering practice in the same system, and attributed by the story's own logic to a man who had both the technical knowledge to execute it precisely and the institutional position to understand exactly what he was bypassing. That is where the certainty stops, and where the story's weight begins. Operational records covering the period after the modification suggest a speed gain of roughly 25 to 30 miles per hour over the Mosquito B Mark IV's baseline of approximately 380 miles per hour. The modified aircraft, reportedly running at plus 20, reached something in the range of 405 to 410 miles per hour at altitude. The figures can't be fully confirmed from primary operations record books, broken down by boost configuration. These numbers appear in narrative analysis of the period rather than in raw wartime data. But the direction of the change is physically consistent with the boost increase, and the magnitude is consistent with the performance differential documented in formal RAF trials at comparable elevated boost settings. The FW-190A was strongest at low to medium altitude, precisely the band 105 Squadron flew in. Recovering 25 to 30 miles per hour of margin at that altitude band changed the interception geometry in a way that polishing the airframe couldn't. The loss rate comparison carries the same epistemic weight. The specific figures, roughly 0.6% of sorties lost at standard boost, roughly 0.33% in the period following the modification, originate in modern narrative treatment, not in period operational research documents. What the broader record does confirm is that the Mosquito ended the war with the lowest loss rate of any aircraft type operated in significant numbers by RAF Bomber Command. The aggregate loss rate over the Mosquito's Bomber Command career was approximately 0.65% per sortie, described in the historical record as by far the lowest of any type in significant service. The transition from its early high-loss daylight phase to its later performance was real. Whether the spring adjustment was a primary driver or a contributing factor in that trajectory, the record hasn't separated out. But it's consistent with the claim that restoring a meaningful speed margin above the FW-190's operational band made a measurable difference to the question of who came home. 6 weeks into 1943, 3 Mosquito B Mark IVs from 105 Squadron departed RAF Marham in the grey Norfolk morning. The date was the 30th of January, the 10th anniversary of Adolf Hitler being made Chancellor. Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring was scheduled to broadcast a speech from the Air Ministry building in Berlin at 11 o'clock. A ceremony meant to celebrate 10 years of National Socialist power, carried live across the Reich. The 3 aircraft flew east at low level across the North Sea, then across occupied Europe, navigating through the cold winter air at an altitude that made radar interception difficult and visual detection dependent on luck and the alertness of observers on the ground. Berlin's air defences were on alert. The city had not been bombed in daylight before. But the 3 Mosquitoes arrived on schedule. At precisely 11 o'clock, they crossed into Berlin's airspace and bombed the Haus des Rundfunks, the main broadcasting station, at the exact moment Göring was due to begin speaking. Radio engineers in the station cut the feed and scrambled for shelter. A confused German public heard the sound of aircraft engines in place of the Reichsmarshal's voice. When the air cleared, the engineers replaced the interrupted program with a recording of military march music. A United Press wire report filed that same afternoon recorded that the attack had delayed Göring's address. The Reichsmarschall, furious, reportedly returned to the microphone long after the planned broadcast slot had passed. 6 weeks later, addressing German aircraft manufacturers, he described the Mosquito in terms that became famous in subsequent historical accounts, complaining bitterly about an aircraft made of wood that could appear over Berlin at noon and disappear before the defences could respond. One aircraft from the morning mission, DZ-367, coded GBJ, was lost to flak near Altengrabo, both crew members killed, though the squadron attribution at the moment of loss has never been fully settled. 3 Mosquitoes from 139 Squadron repeated the intervention that afternoon, timed to coincide with Goebbels' address at the Sportpalast. But it was the RAF's first daylight bombing attack on Berlin, conducted by unarmed wooden aircraft at low level, relying entirely on speed. No primary document confirms whether those 3 105 Squadron aircraft were running the modified boost setting. They were 105 Squadron Mosquitoes at RAF Marham in the period the modification is attributed to. The record there is silent too. Which brings the story to the part that is loudest in its silence. The authorization process for modifying the calibrated settings of operational Merlin engines would normally have involved Rolls-Royce, the Air Ministry, and the relevant technical branches of the Ministry of Aircraft Production. Banks, as the Ministry's Deputy Director General of Engine Production, wasn't ignorant of that process. He had helped administer it. He understood from the inside that what he was reportedly doing at 105 Squadron's aircraft bypassed the channel he was supposed to work through. The modification wasn't a fringe act committed at the edge of the system. It was committed by someone near the centre of the system, against the system's own procedures, for reasons that became evident in the sortie reports. Reasons the official speed limit couldn't accommodate, and the FW190 had already made non-negotiable. What the official record says happened next is very little. Modern accounts assert a punishment, a court-martial, a formal reprimand, some institutional consequence that arrived before anything else. None of them cite a specific archival document, no court-martial proceeding, no fitness notation, no official correspondence confirming disciplinary action for this specific modification has been located in the accessible RAF record. Banks's papers are held at Cambridge University. What they contain on this episode, no published account has yet reported in sufficient detail to resolve the question. What the confirmed biographical record does show is his subsequent career. Director of Engine Production from January 1944, receiving the formal appointment and the acting rank of Air Commodore simultaneously. Full Air Commodore thereafter. Director General of Engine Production, Principal Director of Engine Research and Development in the post-war Ministry of Supply from 1952 to 1953. Director of the Bristol Aeroplane Company from 1954 to 1959. President of the Royal Aeronautical Society from 1969 to 1970, the year he was awarded honorary fellowship. A career that moved in one direction only. The gap between whatever institutional response arrived and that career trajectory is genuinely unnamed in the accessible record. Not unnamed because no one has looked carefully enough, but unnamed because the record itself does not close it. The modification happened, or something very like it happened. A punishment likely followed. The RAF's procedural machinery didn't simply absorb unauthorized fleet-wide engine modifications without formal response. After that, something the official record has declined to specify. The ambiguity isn't a failure of the research, it's the shape of this story as the documents have left it, and filling that gap with invented promotion titles or fictional authorization branches wouldn't make the story truer, only cleaner. Rod Banks published his memoir in 1978. He called it, "I Kept No Diary, 60 Years with Marine Diesels, Automobile and Aero Engines." It's an engineer's memoir, not a decorated commander's. The title itself tells you something about the kind of record he chose to maintain. 60 years of engines, fuels and performance limits. No diary. So here is what can be stated with confidence and what can't. The Mosquito B Mark IV ran its Merlin 21, 23 and 25 engines on a gear-driven centrifugal supercharger, mechanically connected to the crankshaft, governed by an automatic boost controller whose calibrated aneroid capsule and spring assembly set the manifold pressure ceiling at plus 18 psi. That ceiling existed because 100-octane aviation fuel wouldn't reliably suppress detonation above it. Detonation at elevated boost levels destroyed pistons, bearings and cylinder heads through shock waves the metal wasn't designed to absorb. The limit was physically real. 105 Squadron received its first operational Mosquito at RAF Swanton Morley on the 15th of November 1941. It moved to RAF Marham in late September 1942, joining 139 Squadron under No. 2 Group's low-level daylight doctrine. The unarmed design wasn't an accident or an oversight, it was deliberate. Speed in place of guns, maneuverability in place of armour, a survival theory that required a reliable performance margin above the best available interceptor. 2 JG-26, the Abbeville boys, had been flying the FW-190A over northern France since August 1941. And that fighter compressed the Mosquito's margin through 1942 to the point where ground crews were polishing airframes in an attempt to recover what the engines could no longer reliably provide at certified boost settings.
Francis Rodwell Banks, Deputy Director General of Engine Production in late 1942, later Air Commodore, later Director of Engine Production, and President of the Royal Aeronautical Society, is identified in the historical record as the person who addressed that problem. The specific mechanism attributed to him: recalibrating the boost controller's spring or aneroid reference so that every 105 Squadron Merlin held +20 instead of +18, applied across the fleet at Marham from late 1942 through the war's end. The specific act isn't confirmed by a primary wartime document. The mechanism it describes is confirmed as sound engineering. The period in which it's set is confirmed as the period when the problem the modification addresses was most acute, and when the aircraft's survival theory was most exposed. Operational accounts of the modified period suggest a speed gain of roughly 25 to 30 miles per hour, putting the aircraft around 405 to 410 miles per hour at altitude. Loss rate analyses suggest something approaching a halving of the per-sortie casualty rate, from roughly 0.6 to roughly 0.33%. Neither figure can be fully verified against primary wartime records. Both are consistent with what restoring a meaningful speed margin over a pursuing FW-190A at low altitude would produce. The institutional aftermath: punishment arrived, career continued, the space between them is unnamed, is left where the record left it. The polishing law, the 15 knots from a buffed airframe, real, documented as a measure the squadron reportedly attempted, and ultimately beside the point. Surface finish affects drag. The boost controller addressed the power ceiling directly. One is color, the other is mechanism. The illegal boost story that circulates in aviation history, the one some tell with the wrong name, the wrong rank, and the wrong explanation, is actually a story about a spring. A calibrated coil spring in a pressure-sensing capsule at the heart of a Rolls-Royce Merlin automatic boost controller, adjusted so that the equilibrium point shifted from +18 to +20. Applied, reportedly, across every aircraft in 105 Squadron from late 1942 through the war's end. Not a trial modification on a single aircraft. Not an individual ace's personal tweak. A fleet-wide recalibration of the ceiling the specification sheet said couldn't be crossed, executed by an officer who understood exactly what he was doing and exactly what crossing it meant. The FW-190 had already crossed the specific margin the specification sheet said was sufficient. Rod Banks crossed the limit that said the Merlin couldn't safely go higher. The official record never explicitly named what came after. The capsule never got a new specification sheet, and 105 Squadron flew the rest of the war at +20. If you want more stories like this one, the specific mechanism underneath the general legend, subscribe.